we think about ocean protection, we often picture volunteers removing nets, plastic, and debris from the seafloor. But nature has its own cleanup teams. Organisms that quietly recycle nutrients, aerate sediments, and help entire ecosystems function. In this episode of our short series on marine life that helps clean the ocean, we're diving into one of the most underestimated animals out there, the sea cucumber. Often called the earthworm of the sea cucumbers sift through sediment, reduce bacterial loads, and help keep coral reefs healthier. They live everywhere, from shallow tropical waters to the deepest ocean trenches. Some may live for decades. Some might live for a century. They can regenerate organs, survive being split in two, and are even studied for what they can teach us about aging and regeneration. So how did this strange, squishy animal become the subject of serious science? And even a very looked-after book? To find out, I'm joined by Dr. Annie Mercier, co-editor of The World of Sea Cucumbers, to explore why these quiet recyclers might be among some of the ocean's most important engineers. Annie, thank you so much for joining me on the Healthy Seas podcast. It's so great to have you here today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the elephant or cucumber in the room. A major academic book on sea cucumbers called The World of Sea Cucumbers can cost hundreds of dollars. What makes these animals worth hundreds of dollars in scientific knowledge and attention?
I think it's a lot to do with curiosity. It's not even, I would say, the only book on sea cucumbers. There's actually a surprising amount of academic and popular even publications on sea cucumbers. There's growing interest. When I started working on sea cucumbers over 30 years ago, there was not such an interest. We were more like a little bit of eccentric folks working on sea cucumbers. Now, as I said, there's a growing interest. Part of this is due to the commercial nature of a lot of species. So there is that kind of economic driver. But there's a lot of scientific kind of curiosity around them. Many people are now studying sea cucumbers from the academic standpoint, so from the science side of things, which supports a lot of the development of more applied sea cucumber development. But we have more and more experts as well. So this book in particular, The World of Sea Cucumber, was designed to bring together lots of experts worldwide. So there's like biological, ecological, economic, conservation, all sorts of things inside that book. And I guess it's showing that there's a growth in the type of interest that sea cucumbers attract.
So let me take a step back and ask you, what is even a sea cucumber? What do they look like? What do they do? How do I know I'm looking at one?
Yeah, so sea cucumbers, as their common name evokes, their shape is more or less like a cucumber, the vegetable. So it's an elongated, cylindrical type of creature. But importantly, it is an animal. It is not vegetal in any way. It has all the biology of an animal. So it has a mouth, a digestive system, circulation system. It's different because it doesn't really have blood or things like that, but it has a nervous system and it has what we call a hydrovascular system. So its shape and its motion is through a system that is filled with water canals. And that's making it move in a way that's a little bit quirky in the sense that some of them bury in the sediment. Some of them have larger oral tentacles that they deploy in the water column. So they might look a little bit similar to a sea anemone, but their group is really the echinoderms, so the spiny skinned animals. So their relatives that we know well include sea stars and sea urchins. So they're in the same taxonomic group called the echinoderms. And they're actually a taxonomic class called Holothuriidea. And all of them are inside that class, but it's a really rich diversity of shape and biology even. So you cannot group all the sea cucumbers together, a little bit like you would not expect all fish to be the same. You have tiny ones, large ones, predatory ones and some that are more herbivorous. So you have the same type of variability inside the group called the Holotroiidae. And they're large, small, colorful, dull, and yeah, they can be from a few millimeters to over a meter long. Oh. And they live from the right on the shore to the deepest abyss. So they're everywhere in the ocean, but only in marine habitats.
Oh, not freshwater.
No.
Can you explain how their feeding process works and why it's often described as cleaning or recycling the ocean floor, much like what Healthy Seas does?
Yeah, so I was mentioning there's a great diversity of sea cucumbers, and so not all of them feed in the same way. The ones that are often referred to as the earthworms of the sea are the group of species that actually live on the bottom, and they often bury in the sediment, and they ingest the sediment as they move along. So they sift through the sediment, and they actually ingest it in their digestive tract, extracting organic matter, bacteria, and so forth. So they really feed on the organic matter that they find in the sand, in the mud, and so forth. And so in that way, they actually work to extract organic matter and become a link between what's happening in the water column and what's happening on the seafloor. You have also sea cucumbers that are suspension feeders. So instead of sifting through the sediment, they'll actually anchor themselves on hard substratum, and they will deploy the hard substrates. So they will actually anchor like on rocks and boulders. Okay. So they will not move. They will be sedentary, fixed to a hard substrate, and they will deploy oral tentacles like a net in the water and capture particles that are floating in there. So that might be plankton or other organic matter. And so they will bring that to their mouth and ingest it that way. So you have the deposit feeder on the bottom sifting through the sediment, and you have the suspension feeders still living close to the seafloor but feeding from the water column directly.
How much are they influencing sediment chemistry or nutrient cycles or even carbon storage at larger scales?
So it's a little bit difficult to answer that in a simple way. We suspect that the sea cucumbers that are deposit feeders that are going through the sediment, they rework a lot of sediment depending on how you study them, which species you study, because I was mentioning there's such a great diversity. So depending on the species you study, some folks have found maybe between a couple of grams to near 100 grams per day per individual gets processed through the gut of the sea cucumbers. And so you can imagine
grams of sediment or grams of water?
Sediment. It can be sand, it can be mud. It's really going through the tube. And as it goes inside their digestive tube, they're, as I said, extracting the organic matter. And so you can imagine that at a population level where you have dozens or hundreds or even thousands of sea cucumbers, this can quickly become a few tons or several tons being reworked, like inside a bay, for instance. And so it can have an impact because they actually reshuffle the sediment. So that's an important process in the ocean so that the sediment doesn't become what we call anaerobic, so without oxygen. So a little bit like earthworms are doing for our garden soil, kind of aerating it and reworking it. The deposit feeding sea cucumbers do that for the soft bottom of the ocean. They also, because they're ingesting something and pooping something slightly differently, they're slightly different in terms of the chemical nature. They're helping recycle the nutrients. And the ones that are capturing plankton and pooping what can essentially be called sediment are also helping to work the interface between the ocean water and the ocean floor. So they're playing important roles. And they can get, as I said, this processed quite a lot because they're feeding almost continuously for many species. And some people have determined that this can help decrease bacterial load, for instance, on a coral reef. And it may have even an incidence on coral health because of that. So if you remove the sea cucumbers that are feeding on the bacteria and decreasing the bacterial load, you might find that you have more coral disease because of that. So you can see the type. And of course, they serve as buffers as well because they have a carbonate chemistry that's quite important. And so they will have an influence even on the very nature of the chemistry of the seawater. So they play a lot of very important roles in many different marine ecosystems.
Yeah, it sounds like they have an impact on the entire ecosystem.
Yes, exactly. By the way that they feed and that they poop. So what comes in, what comes out is slightly different. They remove some stuff, but they also provide because they have different bacteria inside their gut. And so it changes the nature of the sediment from what comes in and what goes out.
Because they interact with the sediment directly, do they also ingest microplastics and other pollutants?
Yes, so that's actually been shown. So a few scientists have already determined that many species of sea cucumbers, and I should say both the deposit feeders, so the ones that ingest sediment directly, and the ones that extend those tentacles in the seawater, they can also capture floating microplastic particles. And so we know that they are affected by this in the sense that they will ingest the microplastics. What's not very clear is how that might affect them, like their biology, their physiology, their health. A little bit like much of the microplastic work, we know that microplastic is finding its way into animals, organisms, and ecosystems. But the effect, we know more of the large plastic, like the effects on turtles, on birds, those large plastic particles that might create very negative effects. As far as the microplastics go, it's a little bit more difficult to determine what the effects on the biology and physiology of animals might be. Even as humans, we have them in our blood. And it's now very hard when in our lab, we are sometimes thinking about assessing the effects of microplastics. But in science, you usually want to compare with the control where you don't have that. And now it's becoming almost impossible to have that control, that baseline without plastic because it's so pervasive. It's so abundant everywhere that it would be hard to find animals that have never been in contact with those microplastics. So yeah, so it's a challenging kind of line of investigation, but we do know that sea cucumbers indeed ingest microplastic.
You had mentioned earlier about the commercial value of sea cucumbers, and sometimes they're poached or overfished because of their high market value in some countries. What is their commercial value? What are people fishing them for?
So that's also a very intriguing question because in my line of work, I'm a scientist fundamentally, but I've also interacted with many other stakeholders of the sea cucumber industry, including in Asia, China, and other countries. And for a lot of Asian communities or societies, the relationship with sea cucumbers dates back quite a long time ago, so centuries, even millennia ago. So in China, the sea cucumbers are in ancient texts, in legends, so they've been, I guess,
they're culturally
presented.
Important.
Oh yeah, it's weaved into the culture of China and other Asian cultures. And therefore, the importance is mostly related to the health benefit. Early on, based more or less on trial and error, seeing that eating sea cucumbers meant a longer, healthier life. Today, we have science to support some of those claims that they do have health benefits. So that's I should say, the strongest draw to sea cucumbers is the food industry and their benefit. But there's also lately a lot more derivatives, so using the unique biomolecules themselves, so the products that you can extract from sea cucumbers. And so in medicinal and medical and pharmaceutical applications, so you have antibacterial, anti-cancer properties. I've seen studies around diabetes, so trying to lower or prevent the incidence of diabetes. So there's a lot of studies going on about the properties of sea cucumbers or the extracts that you get from sea cucumbers. There's applications in the food industry, in the medical, biomedical science. So the nature of the sea cucumber is often that they're polymorphic, as we say, so they don't have a defined shape. Oftentimes, they can elongate and contract and become flaccid or be very bouncy a little bit more. And so this property is coming from what we call the collagen. So it's a mutable collagen fibers that can rigidify very quickly. And so that property is also something that has been used, I know, to develop things that can become or self-harden in a very rapid manner and then become soft whenever it's kind of hydrated. And so applications, for instance, in brain implants, where you would implant something that's rigid because you need that when you want to do an implant. But then as soon as it is moist, it's becoming completely, it doesn't liquefy, but it becomes a much more pliable and fluid.
Huh.
And so this type of property of the mutable collagen has been explored a lot for sea cucumbers, hydrogels, and all sorts of biotechnological avenues. But the main driver remains the food market and the pharmaceutical market, and then biotechnology as well.
Fascinating. How does this human demand intersect with their ecological role in conservation?
So that's an excellent question. I was mentioning their commercial value, which I suspect initially drew attention to many of the species. There's exceptions of weird and beautiful species that have been studied for the sake of their existence. But many sea cucumbers have been studied mostly because they are of commercial value. So people wanting to learn more about the populations and the growth, basic things like their life history, how they spawn, how they grow, etc., how long they live, which is indeed an interesting question with sea cucumbers. They seem to be immortal in a way. So yeah, so there's a lot of biological, I guess, data that come in the context of wanting to know more about sea cucumbers to either manage a fishery, implement a conservation plan, or even start an aquaculture business. So knowing how to reproduce them and grow them is, of course, super important in that respect. So there's a lot of things that we know now because of the commercial interest. But on the flip side of that, obviously, is that a lot of populations of sea cucumbers have been overfished, depleted to a very alarming point. I'm part of the Species Survival Commission Sea Cucumber Specialist Group as part of the IUCN. So conservation is the focus of that group. And we're finding, obviously, that a lot of species have been depleted. So they're close to extinction, either regionally or globally. And so that's alarming. And the main threat is, of course, their commercial value and the over-harvesting that is going on, because there's a mix of high value, especially on the Asian markets, high demand because we're dealing with Asia, and the access of certain species is very easy, close to the shore, shallow water, tropical, equatorial environment, so quite easy. So this combination of easy access and high value has put a lot of sea cucumbers in a very difficult situation where their populations are dwindling.
Do we know what the big picture ecological impact of their removal is?
I guess that's the next question, because we're just only realizing the full impact of the commercial exploitation. We have to be honest, sea cucumbers are not very charismatic in the sense of, they're not looking like a whale or a turtle or,
Cute
that
face.
people can. Yeah, it's hard to find them totally endearing, or so they look mostly weird, or for some people they look a little bit disgusting, or so that has not helped. The one thing is that there's more and more public interest, or there's more awareness, I should say, about sea cucumbers, both their ecological roles and the threats that are there that will be jeopardizing some populations. So now that we're building our knowledge of their ecological roles and even the ecosystem services that they're providing, because they have value not only as food, but as many other things as well. So, of course, now that we are removing them, I was mentioning the example of the corals and the health of corals. So a few studies have shown that there is a link between the removal of sea cucumbers on certain coral reefs and the worsening health of the corals on that reef. So there are things that, and I'm sure there's more that we actually don't know yet about, but we're developing the knowledge. And for sure, if we're thinking that they're important recyclers, important bioturbator, this is what we call the reworking and oxygenation of the sediments. So they're playing essential roles there. So if they're no longer present, or if they're in insufficient densities, then for sure there will be impacts at the ecosystem level. It's what we call cascading effects. So definitely there's some worry there.
And are there, besides the overfishing or the poaching, are there any other major risks that they're facing?
So everything probably pales in contrast to the overfishing, but you do have threats along the lines of pollution and habitat loss. So your typical threats to wildlife, mostly for those species that occur in coastal areas, shallow water, where you have large human populations, obviously. And so they go and fish them, but for the species that might not yet have a commercial value, they can be impacted by pollution that comes out of the watershed, or pesticides, organic pollutants, and whatnot. And of course, habitat loss, because you have species that live in reefs, live in mangroves, and so forth. And so when those habitats are destroyed, obviously, the sea cucumbers can suffer. And even the deep water sea cucumbers. So as I was mentioning, you have sea cucumbers right down to the trenches, the abyssal trenches of the ocean. And so even for the species that might occur at, 800, 1,000, 2,000 meters, we're seeing some threats now, unfortunately, due to ever deeper fishing practices. So now we're fishing deeper and deeper. So they might be impacted either directly or indirectly most of the time. You have seabed mining. So some sea cucumbers in areas where you have intensive mining, or activities of the oil and gas industry, obviously, as well. So even the ones that we thought maybe a certain number of years ago, when we did the first red list assessment in 2010, which was published in 2013, we had listed 16 species on the red list, some as vulnerable, some as endangered. And we know now, because we did a global reassessment just last fall in 2025, and we know that more species will be listed, and some of the assessments have worsened as well, the status of some species. So unfortunately, there's a lot of different threats. Even sometimes the aquarium hobby, we haven't looked into it much, but there are sea cucumbers that are harvested for that. I don't think it's a major threat now, but eventually, you never know. But definitely pollution and habitat loss are high up there after, obviously, the fishing pressure.
Yeah. You recently co-authored a major review bringing together decades of research on sea cucumbers. Looking at all this work together, what surprised you most about what we now know compared to what scientists believed 20 to 30 years ago?
I don't know if it's a surprise, because I've been immersed in the sea cucumber world for a long time now, but definitely the fact that there's a boom in interest, both positive and negative. So I was saying we're more scientists and stakeholders for conservation and for developing the knowledge of sea cucumbers. Definitely there's more of that. On the other side is that I think one surprise was a lot more species being harvested now than 20, 30 years ago across many more regions of the world. So a lot of new species, and it's always being driven by the sad fact that some of the prized species become difficult to harvest due to population declines. And then the attention turns to another species, and then another species, and so forth. So I guess the pace at which the fisheries have developed worldwide is a surprise. It's definitely worrisome. And the discoveries also, the fact that even for the species that I study quite a bit, I've been around the world and I've explored a few different species, but the one that we have here in Eastern Canada is a very different, biologically speaking, to a lot of the commonly harvested species. And it thrives in huge biomasses, but it's also being fished quite intensively using bottom gear that bring up 10 or 15 tons at a time. So it's very different from the hand harvested species around coral reefs and mangroves and whatnot. But it's surprising to see that we're even probably having an impact on those cold water, very abundant species. And there's more and more. There's every time we try to say there's this many, now we're in the 80s, so 80 some commercial species where we used to have only about 20. And it's growing every day. So there's more and more species. And often people make the mistake of using biological data gathered from the currently exploited species to apply that to a new species because they look alike, but they might be as different as different mammals, for instance, where you have a mouse and a lion. You would never try to assume that the findings of the biology and the life history of a mouse could apply to a lion. So in sea cucumbers, you have such a taxonomic diversity where we're making that shortcut because we're just superficially seeing that they look alike, but they have a different biology, they have a different way to reproduce, they have a different way to feed. And so sometimes it's becoming hard to manage them properly just because we don't know enough about them. I think the boom of information, but also the lack of knowledge are both quite a surprise.
What are the most important trends scientists are seeing today?
One thing I'm glad to see is things like this. So being contacted to actually talk about sea cucumbers, that would not have happened probably 30 years ago. So there is, as I said, global awareness, more interest in sea cucumbers, and the more people know about them and their fantastic lives, the more hopefully they will want to take care of them. And indirectly, this will help our oceans to stay healthier.
We certainly hope so. So if we want oceans that function well and stay resilient, what's the most urgent thing scientists, conservationists, and the public should understand about protecting sea cucumbers?
One of the first things that I try to convey is the diversity. So a lot of times people refer to a sea cucumber or that species or this is that animal. And so the first thing is really to try to develop our understanding of the diversity of species, the diversity of roles, so they cannot be packaged into one simple group. And this applies to their role that they're playing in the ocean. So I think this is one of the key challenges, is not be afraid to study more species, more habitats at different depths and different geographic location in the coral reefs, but in the Arctic, in the Antarctic, everywhere, so that we have a better understanding of their role in various different ecosystems. So I think that's definitely what we need. And learning more about really the species we're studying. We've been studying it for 35 years and we still discover stuff. We thought that we had seen it all.
Yeah.
But and interestingly, some of the discoveries we make around sea cucumbers are applicable more largely to animals that live on the seafloor more generally. So we're even changing the paradigms of understanding a large group of animals based on sea cucumbers as model species in regeneration and things like that, and longevity, what happens to aging and whatnot. So sea cucumbers are not only interesting in and of themselves, they are also biological models for a lot of things. And what people might not know is that they sit close to us on the tree of life. So, yes. So echinoderms are very close to chordates. So we're chordates. We are mammals inside the chordata phylum. And echinodermata is another phylum. And it's really next to us. So much higher, because that's the way that we're seeing it, obviously, us at the top. And so they sit quite high. And so they're invertebrates. They don't have a spine, but they nevertheless have a way of developing. So at the larval stage, that is very close to what humans and other mammals and other chordates have in common. So what we find out about them in an evolutionary context has a lot of importance. And so we can use sea cucumbers and other echinoderms as biological models for things like longevity, regeneration of cells, of tissues, and all these types of things. So there's quite a bit of knowledge we can draw from sea cucumbers, apart from the ecological roles that they play, and apart from the food that they bring us and the medicine and so forth.
Speaking of longevity, you mentioned it before. How long do sea cucumbers live?
It's something that's it's at the core of the questions that we're trying to answer, in part because in conservation science, I was talking about the red list. When you're assessing species, it's important to know how often they reproduce, what's their generation time, how long do they live, those very basic parameters of a life history. And for sea cucumbers, it's not easy. It's not straightforward to uncover this. For some tropical species, we've estimated it's a few decades because we kind of base this on the fact that they reproduce often. They grow quite fast early on in their lives. And so they attain sexual maturity maybe in a year or two or thereabout. And so we extrapolate. As I said, I don't think anybody has surveyed a sea cucumber from the beginning to the end of its life. So this question remains unanswered, but we estimate 15, 20, 25, 30, thereabout. But for cold water species, where metabolic processes are very much slower, where they spawn only once a year, they grow to maturity in several years, 2, 3, 4, even more than that. I've had some in the lab here that, after a year, they still are barely visible to the naked eye. And so when we extrapolate to these more long-lived, late-maturing species, it's more in the order of several decades, 100 or beyond 100 years.
Wow.
And it's been known for certain relatives of sea cucumbers. I was saying they're echinoderms, so sea urchins, for instance, that have a skeleton that you can actually try to date, which is not the case for most sea cucumbers. So it's been shown or suggested that they may live hundreds of years and more. And so in that context, we can estimate that certain sea cucumbers would live 50, 100 or more years. And there's even theories about their being immortal in the sense that if they are not attacked by a predator or collected by a fisher person, then they might never die because the natural causes of death and senescence, so the aging of tissues and so forth, is really something that's not clearly affecting sea cucumbers. So they can be cut and regenerate. And some sea cucumbers can split in two and both halves will live. Some of them, only one, the anterior half will live. They can expel their organs seasonally or because they're stressed, and they will regrow them entirely. All the visceral mass will be regrown.
What?
So yeah, so they have all sorts of behaviors and capacities that are very intriguing with respect to longevity and the secrets of eternal life. So there's a lot of research on sea cucumbers and other echinoderms revolving around these types of questions.
Oh, we can go in so many different directions and talk about this for hours.
Yes, they're fascinating, I tell you.
Yes, absolutely.
There's many avenues where sea cucumbers have value. And I think I guess we need to explore the breadth of that and explore as many species from as many regions and ecosystems as we can, because we never know what we will learn.
Thank you. And again, just like healthy seas, as cleaner of the seas, sea cucumbers have a very similar role. So in a way, they're our spirit animal, and we are big fans of sea cucumbers. Annie, this was very interesting. Thank you for taking the time to chat with me today.
It was a great pleasure, and I hope people will be enticed to discover more about sea cucumbers.
I'm certainly intrigued. Thanks for listening to the Healthy Seas podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, follow and share it with others who care about the ocean. Want to dive deeper? Subscribe to our newsletter at healthyseas.org/newsletter for behind-the-scenes stories, upcoming projects, and partner updates from around the world. There are many ways to be part of the mission. Donate, partner, spread the word, or simply stay connected. Explore how at healthyseas.org/take-action. Together, we can turn marine waste into waves of change.